Hello, this is Eric Topol with Ground Truth, and I'm with my friend and colleague, who's an extraordinary fellow, Dr. Peter Hotez. He's the founding dean of the National School of Tropical Medicine and university professor at Baylor, also at Texas Children's, founding editor of the Public Library Science and Neglected Tropical Disease Journal. And I think this is, Peter, your fifth book.
That's my fifth single author book. That's right. That's right.
Fifth book. So that's pretty amazing. Peter, welcome, and it's great to have a chance to have this conversation with you.
Oh, it's great to be here and great to be with you, Eric. And I've learned so much from you during this pandemic. And my only regret is not getting to know you before the pandemic. My life would have been far richer. And
Well, I
I
see.
think I first got to really know about you. You were our my medical school, Baylor College of Medicine, awarded you an honorary doctorate, and that's when I began reading about you. And I
Oh,
said, "Holy cow! Haven't I been with this guy before?" So
oh
it's
my gosh! So you must have been there that year when I came to the graduation,
no,
perhaps.
I actually was speaking at another graduation. That's why I couldn't be
Ah,
there.
right, as you
That's
typically
it.
do, right? Well, it's kind of amazing to track your career. Besides, your baccalaureate at Yale and PhD at Rockefeller, MD at Cornell, but you started off, I think, deep into hookworm. Is that where you kind of got your
Yeah,
your
yeah,
your
and
base?
I'm still there. Actually, the hookworm vaccine that I started working on as an MD PhD student at Rockefeller and Cornell is now in phase 2 clinical trials.
Wow.
So, which as I tell people is about the average time frame for about 40 years is about a not an unusual time frame. These parasites are obviously very tough targets.
Oh
And
man.
then we have
You,
a
you,
schistosomiasis vaccine in clinical trials and a Chagas disease vaccine. That's always been my lifelong passion is making vaccines for these neglected parasitic infections. And the story with COVID was I had a collaboration with Dr. Sarah Lustigman at the New York Blood Center, and we were working on a river blindness vaccine for onchocerciasis. And she said, "Hey, I want you to meet these two scientists in New York Blood Center. They're working on something called coronavirus vaccines. They were making vaccines for severe acute respiratory syndrome and SARS, and ultimately MERS. And so we plugged their some of their discoveries into our vaccine development machine, and they had found that if you were using the receptor binding domain of the spike protein of SARS and ultimately MERS, it produced an equivalent protective immune response neutralizing antibodies without the immune enhancement. And that's what we wrote to the NIH to do. And they supported us with a $6 million grant back in 2012 to make SARS and MERS vaccines. And then when COVID-19 hit, when the sequence came online in bioRxiv in like early 2020, we just pivoted our program to COVID, and we were able to hit the ground running, and it worked. Everything just clicked and worked really well, and stars aligned, and we were then transferred that technology. We did it with no patent, minimizing strings attached to India, Indonesia, Bangladesh, any place that we felt had the ability to scale up and produce it. India went the furthest. They developed it into Corbevax, which has reached 75 million kids in India, and another 10 million as for their primary immunization, another 10 million as adult booster. And then Indonesia developed their own version of our technology called Indavac, and that's also reaching millions of people. And now they're using it also as a booster for Pfizer because I think it may be a superior booster. So it was really exciting to, after working on parasitic disease vaccines, which are tough targets and decades to get it through the clinical trials, because the pressure was on to move quickly. Goes to show you when people prioritize it. And also the fact that I think viruses are more straightforward targets than complex parasites. And so
well, it's
so in all, about 100 million doses have been administered. And
yeah, no, it's just a spectacular story. Corbevax and these other named of the vaccine that you and Maria Bottazzi put together, and without a patent, at incredibly low cost, and not in the U.S., which is so remarkable because as we exchanged recently, the U.S. The companies, and that's three: Moderna, Pfizer, and Novavax, are going to charge well over $110 per booster of the new booster, updated XBB.1.5, and you've got one that could be $2 or $4,
That's
and it's
right. So
getting
we're making the XBB recombinant protein booster of ours, and part of it's the technology. It's done through microbial fermentation in yeast, and it's done in a big bioreactor, and it's an older technology that's been around a couple of decades, and there's no limit to the amount you could scale. The yields are really high, so we can do this for $2 to $3 a dose, and it'd even be less if it wasn't for the cost of the adjuvant, the CpG. The nucleotide is probably the most expensive component, but the antigen is, probably pennies to when you're doing it at that scale, and so that's really meaningful. I'd like to get our XBB booster into the U.S.
yeah, it's just
But
no
we're not a
respect from
we're not a pharma company, so we didn't get support from Operation Warp Speed, and so we didn't get any U.S. subsidies for that. And it's just very hard to get on the radar screen of BARDA and those agencies, and because they're all set up to work with pharma companies.
yeah, no, it's just not right. And who pays for this is the people, the public, because the affordability is going to have a big influence on who gets boosters, and it's
Yeah, so
driving
so what I
inequity.
say is we provide, the anti-vaccine guys like to call me a shill for pharma, not knowing what they're talking about. We've done the opposite, right? We've provided a path that shows you don't need to go to big pharma all the time, and so they should be embracing what we're doing. So we have this new model for how you can get low cost vaccines out there. Not to demonize the pharma companies either. They do what they do, and they do a lot of important innovation. But there are other pathways, especially for resource poor nations. So we'd love to get this vaccine in the U.S. I think it's looking like it'll work just as well. But
Yeah, I mean,
it's not
I don't want to
set up for that.
demonize the vaccine companies either, but to raise the price fivefold just because it's not getting government subsidy, and the billions that have been provided by the government through taxpayer monies,
Yeah, well, the
and that's
Kaiser
fair.
Family Foundation reported that they did an analysis that pharma, I think it was Pfizer and Moderna, got 25 to 30 billion dollars in U.S. subsidies, either for development costs for Moderna. I think Pfizer didn't accept development costs, but they both took advanced purchase money. So $30 billion, and that's not how you show gratitude to the American people, by
No,
jacking up the price
no,
times four. I
no.
think I said, guys, have some situational awareness. I mean, do you want people to hate you? I mean,
Yeah, that's what it
and
looks like. Well,
and
speaking of, before I get to kind of the anti-science, the deadly rise of anti-science, your new book, I did want to set it up that you spent a lot of your career, besides working on these tropical diseases, challenging diseases, leishmania and Chagas, schistosomiasis, the ones you've mentioned. You've also stood up quite a bit for the low middle income countries with books that you've written previously about forgotten people, blue marble health. And so I don't want to dismiss that because it's really important and it ties in with what the work you've done with the Corbevax or COVID vaccine. Now, what I really want to get into is the book that you wrote that kind of ushered in your very deep personal interest in anti science and anti vax, which I'm going to in a minute ask you to differentiate. But your daughter, Rachel, you wrote a book about her and about vaccines not causing autism. So, can you tell us about that?
yeah. So as you point out, my first two books were about these, what I would call forgotten diseases or forgotten people. In fact, that's what the first book was called: Forgotten People, Forgotten Diseases, which my kids used to call Dad's forgotten book on forgotten people and forgotten diseases. All the now it's in its third edition. But it talks about the how important these conditions are. It's just that they're widely prevalent. It's just that they're occurring among people who live in extreme poverty, including people in poverty in the United States. That's why we set up our School of Tropical Medicine on the U.S. Gulf Coast. I didn't do it for the summer weather, which is these days in this heat dome, it's like living on planet Mercury right now here in Texas. But um, and then so that's how I started learning how to advocate, for people and for diseases through neglected diseases. But when we came to Texas, we saw this very aggressive anti-vaccine movement, and they were making false claims that vaccines cause autism. And I said, look, I'm a vaccine scientist here in Texas. I have a daughter with autism, Rachel, with intellectual disabilities, and so if I don't say something, who does? And then wrote the book. Vaccines did not cause Rachel's autism, which unfortunately made me public enemy number one or two with anti-vaccine
Mm,
groups.
mm,
But it does a deep dive explaining the science, showing there's absolutely no link between vaccines and autism, but also an absence of plausibility, because what we know about autism, how it begins in early fetal brain development through the action of autism genes, and we actually did whole exome genomic sequencing on Rachel and my wife Ann and I, and we found Rachel's autism gene, which is, like many of them, involved in early neuronal communication and connections. It was actually a neuronal cytoskeleton gene, as
mm,
are many, in
mm.
this case, a neuronal spectrum. And that one hadn't been reported before, but other neuronal cytoskeleton genes had been reported by the Broad Institute at Harvard, MIT, and others. And that was important to have that alternative narrative, because the refrain from always was, okay, doc, if vaccines don't do it, what does cause autism? And being able to have that other side of the story, I think, is very compelling.
What was it?
Um,
The fabricated paper by Andrew Wakefield in the Lancet that got all this started, or did it really antedate the
there was
autism
something
vaccine? Like,
before in the 80s about the DPT, the diphtheria, pertussis, tetanus vaccine, claiming it caused seizures and then could lead to neurodevelopmental difficulties. But it really took off with the
mm,
Wakefield paper in
mm,
1998, published in the Lancet, and that claimed that the MMR vaccine, a live virus vaccine, had the ability to replicate in the colon of kids, and somehow that led to pervasive developmental disorder. That was the term used back then, and that was Rachel's diagnosis. And it never made sense to me how something, because the reason it's pervasive is it's global in the central nervous system in the brain, and how could something postnatally do something like that? I mean, there are epigenetic underpinnings of autism as well. And that's fun, Eric. You ever try to talk to lay audience about epigenetics?
that's a
That's
tough
that
one.
that's a tough. You start talking about microRNAs and DNA methylation
Yeah,
and
you get it.
histone modification. The
Oh,
lights go out pretty quickly,
chromatin and
but
histone modifications, and
right,
bye
right,
bye. Yeah,
yeah,
you
yeah,
got that
right.
one.
So
But
that's tough. But
that was your really,
but
you
that's when
basically
I started going up against Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and all that was pre-pandemic.
that
What
was in
happened
2018, right?
2017? Trump
2017.
came out and said, it was about to be inaugurated, and RFK Jr. said he was going to be appointed to run a vaccine commission by the Trump administration, and I actually was sitting, in my office, and my assistant said, Dr. Francis Collins and Dr. Anthony Fauci are on the phone. Do you have time to talk with them? And I said, yeah, I think so. And and they had arranged for me to, because I have a daughter with autism, could articulate why vaccines don't cause autism, arranged for me to speak with RFK Jr. through a mediator, and it didn't go well. He was just really dug in,
So he was
and
just as bad then as now.
yeah, I mean, it was just kept on, as I say, moving the goalposts. You couldn't pin him down. Was he talking about MMR? Was he talking about thimerosal? Was he talking about spacing vaccines too close together? Alumin vaccines? That always kept on moving around, and then it was not even autism at times you were talking about. It was something called chronic illness. What do you do with
Mm,
that? And
mm.
so and that's when I was challenged by Joe Rogan and Elon to debate RFK Jr. It's one of the reasons I didn't want to do it, because I knew doing it in public would be no different from doing this in private, that it would not be a productive conversation.
Yeah, no, I do want to get into that because that was the latest chapter of kind of vicious anti-science, which was taking on COVID and vaccines and the whole ball of wax, whereby you were challenged by Joe Rogan on his very big podcast, which apparently is bigger than CNN or
Hmm.
various cable news
Which
networks.
I had done. I had been on his show a couple
Yeah,
of times, and that was
yeah.
okay. I mean, I actually liked the experience quite a bit,
And he challenged
and
you to go on with RFK Jr. and then Elon Musk, joined, and
actually
they
started
ganged
before
up on
then. About the week before, or a few days before, Steve Bannon publicly declared me a criminal, and which I said, wow, that's something. And then Roger Stone weighed in, so it was this whole sort of frontal attack from
well,
people
and
with extremist viewpoints,
there's
and
been a long history. And Tucker Carlson in the book, quote, he, referring to Hotez, is a misinformation machine constantly spewing insanity. Speaking of projecting things, my
yeah,
goodness.
yeah. Well, he did that. He that was in 2022. It was He went on his broadcast the evening after the evening of the in the during that day. I with Mary Elena, we were nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, and I guess, and I don't know if the two are related or not. I think it may have driven him off the edge, and then he just went on this rant against me, and claimed I have no experience anything about COVID. I mean, we had made two COVID vaccines, right, and transferred the technology, nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, and just admitted all of that. But this is how these guys work. It's all about asserting control, and it seems to come from an extremist element of the far right. And it's not that I'm a very political person at all. I mean, I've been here in Texas now for 12 years, and I gotten to know people like Jim Baker and his wife Susan Baker, and a lot of prominent Republicans here in Texas. That wasn't an issue. This is something sort of weird and twisted. And the point that I make in the book is, and it's not just a theoretical concern or a construct, it's the fact that so many Americans lost their lives during the Delta and BA1 Omicron waves in 2021, 2022, after vaccines were widely and freely available, because they refused a vaccine. So vaccines were rolled out in 2021. We started strong, and then vaccination rates stalled, and then we didn't get very far by this after the spring, because there was this launch of a wave of what I call anti-vaccine or anti-science aggression, that deliberately sought to convince Americans not to take a COVID vaccine, and
Yeah,
particularly
and your
in
chapter,
Texas.
yeah, your chapter in the book, Red COVID,
Yeah,
gets into it, quantifies it, hundreds of thousands of lives lost. And I know you've seen some of the papers whereby studies in red states or states like Ohio and Florida showing the connection between
yeah, yeah.
this.
I relied heavily on this guy Charles Gaba, who has a website called ACA Signups, and he did some really strong analysis showing that the people who were refusing COVID vaccines and losing their lives were overwhelmingly in red states, and could even show the redder the county, as measured by voters, the lower the immunization rate and higher the death rates. And the term red COVID came from David Leonhardt of the New York Times, wrote an article about Charles Gaba's work, and he called it red COVID and did a lot of updates. And the data is so strong. I mean, so much so that one person at the Kaiser Family Foundation wrote, if you wanted to ask me whether or not a person was vaccinated and I could only know one thing about them, she said the one thing I'd want to know is what political party they're affiliated with. It's that strong. And it's not that I care about your politics, even your extreme views, but somehow we have to uncouple this one from it, because somehow not getting vaccinated has been added to the canon of stuff that you're supposed to believe in if you're down that rabbit hole watching Fox News every night, or listening to Rogan podcasts and that sort of stuff. And somehow we have to uncouple those two, and it's the hardest thing I've ever had to do. First of all, it's unpleasant to talk about, because all of your training, Eric, mine as well, is said you don't talk about politics, and we're supposed to be above all that. But what do you do when the death and dying is so strong on one side? And uh, I was in East Texas not too long ago, giving grand rounds at a new medical school in East Texas, in Tyler, Texas, and very conservative part of the state. And basically everyone you talk to has lost a loved one because
Hmm.
they refused a COVID vaccine and died. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
that's where you really start to see that. And these people are wonderful people. I gave Bob Harrington
Oh, yes. Very much.
at Stanford as
Very
chair of
well.
medicine. Now he's going to be the dean of Cornell. He invited me with Michelle Berry to give grand rounds, medical grand rounds at Stanford. And I said, look, if my car had broken down and had a flat tire, and I can't fix anything. I'm a disaster at fixing anything. So if you said, okay, you had the choice, where do you want your car broken down? In Palo Alto, California, where Stanford is, or very wealthy enclave, or East Texas? I'd say I'd pick East Texas in a second, because in East Texas, they'd be fighting over who was going to rush to help you change your tire. And
Right.
these are just incredible people, and they were victims. They were victims of this far right attacks from Fox News. And one of the things I do in the book is, the documentation is really strong. Media Matters, the watchdog group, has looked at the evening broadcasts of Tucker Carlson, Laura Ingraham, and Hannity, and can I, actually identify the anti-vaccine content with each broadcast during the summer and fall. And then a social science research group out of ETH Zurich, the Federal University of Technology of Zurich, where Einstein studied, actually. One of the great universities did another analysis and showed that watching Fox News is one of the great predictors of refusing a vaccine. And so those were the amplifiers, but those generating a lot of the messages were elected leaders coming out of the House Freedom Caucus, or Senator Johnson, this conservative senator. I don't even like to use the word conservative, because it's not really that they're conservative; they're extremists. And
Yeah.
Senator Johnson of Wisconsin, or Rand Paul, of Kentucky, you know,
A
with all
physician,
of,
no less.
and
Yeah.
then physician, and the CPAC conference of
Hmm.
conservatives in Dallas in 2021. They said, first they're going to vaccinate you, and then they're going to take away your guns and your Bibles. And as ridiculous as that sounds to us, people in my state of Texas and elsewhere in the South accepted it and didn't take a COVID vaccine and paid for it with their lives. And how do we, begin walking that back? And the point of writing the book said, well, the first step is to at least describe it so people can know what we're talking about. Because I think right now, when you look at the way people talk about anti-vaccine or anti-science stuff, they call it misinformation, or the infodemic, like it's just some random junk that appears out of nowhere on the internet. And it's not any of those things. It's organized, it's well financed, it's politically motivated, and it's killing Americans on a massive scale. So I said, look, I went, did my MD and PhD in New York at Rockefeller and Cornell. I devoted my life to becoming a vaccine scientist. The motto of Rockefeller University used to be the Rockefeller Institute of Medical Research, is translates to science for the benefit of humanity. And I believe making vaccines was one of the high expressions of it. And I think most physician scientists believe. I think you believe that too, and that's why
Absolutely.
you're in this as well. Not vaccines, but other life saving interventions. And so I said, well, now making vaccines is not enough, because now we have to counter all of this anti-vaccine stuff. And was nobody better, in terms of my training and my background going up against anti-vaccine movements because of Rachel, to do this. So I've done it, and
Yeah. Well, you've done it all right.
that's
And
that's what my wife Ann says. You've done it all right.
well, as I wrote in your with your book, the blurb about you are a new species, the physician scientist warrior, and you are, Peter, because you're the only one of all the physicians. We're talking about a million docs almost in this country who has stood up, and you've put your life at risk, your family at risk. You've had death threats. You've had the people, come right to your house. And so what you've described, this kind of coalescence of political will of extremists, media, of course, amplification because it benefits them. They're selling more. They get more viewers, more spots for commercials, and more they can charge. And then you even, as you described in the book so well, is you even have outside interested parties like Russia as part of this organization of this coalescence of forces that are taking on the truth, that are promoting anti-science, that are winding up people are dying or
Yeah,
having
yeah.
serious
Yeah,
morbidity, right?
in the case of Russia, it's a slightly different motivation. What they're doing is they're filling the internet and social media with both anti-vaccine messages and pro-vaccine
Mm,
messages, because what
mm.
they have a different agenda. Their agenda is destabilize democracies. So what they're doing is they're cherry picking certain issues that they can use as a wedge to sow discord. And so when they saw the stuff about vaccines, yeah, they'll flood it with both pro and anti-vaccine message. And you see the stuff on Twitter, so much of it is computer
Oh,
generated, and it's just repeats the same stuff over and over again. And a lot of that are, some of that, not all only Russia. I think China's doing it, North Korea, Iran's doing it, but particularly Russia. And that was documented by a colleague of mine, David Broniatowski, who's a computer scientist at George Washington University. Has really done a deep dive in that. So
yeah, I
that's
think a lot of
another
people are
component.
not aware. That's what your book brings to light of how organized, how financed, how this thing is a machine from coming from many different domains, and for different interests, as you just summarized. So it's actually scary. And besides you standing up and facing, the really ultimate bravery with all of these factions attacking you, literally ad hominem, personally attacking you, then you have, this continues to get legs throughout the pandemic, and there's no counter, as you touched on. What is going to be done? You can't stand up alone on this.
Yeah,
I mean,
well,
yeah,
there's a couple of things. First of all, it's not only attacking the science; it's attacking the scientists, right?
right, right, exactly.
It's and you get it too as well. I mean, it's basically portraying scientists as enemies of the state, which
Yeah.
I think is so dangerous. I mean, as I like to say, this is a nation that's built on science and technology, right? The strengths of our research universities and institutions like Scripps, like Baylor, like Rockefeller, like MIT and Stanford and University of Michigan and University of Chicago. This is what, helped us defeat fascism in World War II, as evidenced by the Oppenheimer movie, right? And or allowed us to achieve so many things. Why people so admire our nation. When I served as U.S. science envoy in the Obama administration, the State Department, and the White House. I mean, that's where people loved our country. Is they all want to study at our research universities, or they want their kids to study at our research universities. And by attacking not only science but the scientists, I think it's weakening our stature globally, and I think that's another aspect. I think the other problem is we don't get the backing that I think we should from the scientific societies, and at times even the national academies. I think they could be out there more. Exactly why, I think part of it is they see how I get beat up, and they say, "Well, who wants that?" Right? And I
Yeah.
and I and I understand that, but I think also, they depend on oftentimes on government funding, and I think they're worried that, if again, it's this idea that you have to be politically neutral, even if it favors the tormentor or the aggressor, to paraphrase Desmond Tutu or Elie Wiesel, and that's part of it as well. I mean, I do find it meaningful. It's scary at times, but I do find it meaningful to have this role. But getting more help and backing. I mean, I mean, Baylor College of Medicine, Texas Children's Hospital, been pretty good. Having my back. It's not that way at every, and I know Scripps has been really strong with what Christian Anderson's had to deal with around all the phony baloney around COVID origins, but not all. academic health centers are that way, and I think we need our university presidents to be more vocal on this issue, and too often they're not, as well as our academies and our scientific societies, because this is, I believe, going to do irreparable harm to
Well,
science
yeah,
and
in my experience too, we've actually seen, academic physicians who have basically, supported conspiracy theories, who have detracted from evidence and science, in a major way. Some of at leading universities here, as you mentioned, and when I've contacted and others, their leadership, they say, "Well, freedom of speech," because they're afraid to confront them because all the different things you've mentioned social media, but no, the universities don't want to get attacked on social media. They're afraid of that. They're afraid of calling out one of the people, faculty members, who are deliberately garnering a
yeah,
lot of
and the
attention.
point is, it's not just, freedom of speech in the sense of espousing crazy views. It's the fact that they're going on the attack against.
Hmm.
I mean, I don't attack these guys, but they attack me with impunity and say
Yes.
terrible untrue things about me. I mean, there's isn't there something called professionalism or
Yeah.
ethics?
Well,
Don't we, aren't we supposed to be instilling that in our faculty, and that doesn't seem to happen. So
no,
that's troubling as well.
they're making credible scientists who are doing the best they can into pinatas
Right.
and attacking them and it can't be reciprocated because that's beneath professionalism. I mean, just as you say. So they just keep going at it. So what you have is now we've added all these different entities, and I'll add more. One more is AI, which is going to further blur truth
Yeah.
and falsehoods.
Yeah, Renee DiResta at the Stanford Internet Observatory. I don't know if you know Renee. She does fabulous work, and she's written about what happens when all of the anti-science, anti-vaccine stuff is now imbued with AI, and it's going to become even more sophisticated and more difficult to
No, there's going to
counter.
be a video of you saying that these vaccines are killing people. Don't get a booster, and it'll be just like you with your voice.
Yeah,
And
well,
it'll be
they already have now these. There's these few things on YouTube that's claim I'm secretly Jack Black, the actor, and that the CIA has arranged it so that Jack Black plays this fictional character named Doctor Peter Hotez, and they do all these things like focus in on my eyes and do like eye identification. It's just nuts. I mean, what's out there?
well. Has there been a time in these months where you were very scared, you for yourself or your family because of all the incredible density and what appears to be very serious threats and requiring protection?
During the day I'm okay. I mean, and when the Steve Bannon stuff and Joe Rogan stuff, then I had the stalking at the house, and I had to have a Houston Police Department officer parked in front of my house, or a Harris County sheriff. That was troublesome, but it's more of during the day I'm fine. I'm working, I'm talking, to people like you, and in lab meetings, doing what scientists do, writing grants and throwing pencils at the wall when you get a paper with a major review or a major revision or rejection. But it's, I think, at night, wake up in the middle of the night, and it's the stuff does start to mess with your head at
Yeah.
times, and it's
Well,
so
and
it,
as you travel a lot, and you've I think expressed that hey, you could be given a talk in an innocent place, and somebody could come, attack you there.
yeah.
I
So
know.
I have security now at major venues when I speak. Uh, and there was an incident at the World Vaccine Congress in Washington. There were protesters out in front of the convention center waiting for me. That
Mm,
wasn't fun.
mm.
And so even we'll see what happens with when the I'm doing a number of events around the book in Washington D.C. and New York and elsewhere. We'll see how that goes. So
Well,
take it day by day.
I know you well enough to know that you're an optimistic person. I mean, you've been smiling and we've been laughing during this and discussing some very heavy, serious stuff. What gives you still optimism that this can someday get on track?
Well, I think it could get worse before it gets better, first of all, and two fronts. One, I had the opportunity to meet with Dr. Tedros, the World Health Director General of the World Health Organization, towards the end of last year, and to say this could be the warm up act in the sense that now it's globalizing. I'm anticipating spillover to all childhood immunization rates. And, you're starting to see the same US style of anti vaccine rhetoric now, even in low and middle income countries on the African continent and South Asia. So I worry about, measles and polio, both in the US and globally. I think I'm worried about that. The other is, a lot of this is heating up, I think, because of the 2024 presidential election. I think one was that with our mutual friend and colleague Anthony Fauci, now that he's out of government, he's not as visible as he was. I think the extremists are looking around for another. They need a monster, right, to galvanize the base, and I think I've become that monster. That's one thing I'm worried about. But also, I talk to probably someone you've seen on Twitter, and I've gotten to know her somewhat. I'm very impressed with her, Molly Jongfast, who's
Mm,
a
mm,
commentator on CNN and MSNBC, and she, put out there, and she told me privately and put it out in public that one of the reasons why things are so vicious around RFK Jr. is they see him as a third party
mm,
candidate that could take Biden votes away and help create a path for Trump being elected. So by having me debate him, it kind of in its own way elevated his stature and made him seem like a more serious
right,
person.
right.
And my refusal, popped their bubble, and that's one of the reasons why they're so angry. So this is very much tied, I think, to the 2024 presidential election. And that's what you're having seen with the House subcommittee hearings too, portraying scientists as enemies of the state. It's all for, I mean, I don't know if you've seen that House subcommittee Twitter site. It actually says something like, "We're selling popcorn."
Yeah, I know.
I
I
mean,
saw. I mean, just
they're not even pretending it's
yeah.
anything other than
They're
political theater for Fox News soundbites. So I think
no,
we're going to
theater is the
see,
word, all right. Yeah.
yeah, but the attacks on biomedical science, I think, are going to be, have a long term effect. If for no other reason, I think people are going to think twice about wanting to do a PhD in biomedical scientist or become an MD PhD scientist when they see that, we're
Well, that's what
portrayed in this
you
way.
also covered that really well
Yeah.
in the book. But when you think about where we are now with climate crisis, or we're facing future pandemics, not just the one we're still working through here. Um, where is the hope that we can counter this? I mean, we need armies of people like you. We need, as you say, the scientific establishment and community all stand up. That gets me to one of the things that makes you differentiates you from most physicians and scientists. You write books. You are active on social media. You appear on the media. Most scientists grew up to have their head down, do the work, do good science, get their stuff published and get grants and, try to advance the field. And physicians doing that or taking care of patients, same kind of thing. What prompted you in your career to say, hey, that's not enough. I got another dimension. And how can we get millions of clinicians and scientists to rally to
Yeah,
do what
and
you're doing?
well, in my case, it's not that I was deliberately seeking to be a public figure, or what some call a public intellectual. It was more the case, the issues that I was most interested in, nobody was talking about,
Mm,
and nobody was going to talk about it. So if I didn't talk about it, it wasn't going to be talked about. So neglected tropical diseases,
yeah,
it
forgotten
was,
people.
and I had two colleagues in the UK, Alan Fennick and David Mullen, who felt the same way. And so we became the three musketeers of the neglected tropical disease space. And I found that extremely meaningful and interesting. And it was the same with vaccines. So although I'm often in the doing a lot of public engagement. If you notice, I don't try to be like some people who do it very well, like a Sanjay Gupta or some others that will, or Megan Rainey that will talk about, just about any health issue. I don't try to do that. I sort of stay. It's a wide lane, but I try to stay in my lane around infectious, neglected diseases and vaccines. And I think
Right.
that's very important. Now, in terms of, the statement, most scientists or physician scientists want to keep their head down, write their grants and papers. I think that's perfectly fine. I don't think people should be forced to do it. But I think there's enough of us out there that want to do it, but don't know how to get started and don't feel safe doing it. And so I think we need to change that culture. I think we
Mhm.
need to offer science communication to our graduate students in their PhD programs or in MD PhD programs, for those who want to do it, or in residency training or fellowship training. And so that, because there are things you can learn. I mean, we had to do it by trial and error, and in my case, more error than trial. But but there are things you can learn from people who do this professionally. So I think that's important. I think the other is we need to change the culture of the institutions. I get evaluated just like you do, like everybody, like any senior scientist or professor at a university. And what do they ask me about? They ask me about my grants and my papers, preferably in high impact journals. And they ask me, and I don't see patients anymore, so they don't ask me about my clinical revenue, but they ask me about my grants and papers and my grants and papers and my grants and papers, right? There's not even any place on my form, my annual evaluation form, to put in the single author books I've written, much less
Yeah.
the opinion pieces I've written, or certainly not social media, or even the cable news channel. So it basically, the academic health center is sending the message, and I don't think that's unique. I think that's probably the rule in most places. I think the culture of academic health centers is they're sending a message. They're saying, well, we don't consider that stuff important, and somehow we have to make it important,
I
for
think
those who want to do it,
absolutely.
to send that message.
You're pointing out a critical step that has to be undertaken in the future. It'll take time to get that to gel, hopefully, but if it's promoted actively, I certainly promote that. I know you do
Yeah, I
with
think I
your
think most
folks,
most
but
offices of communications at academic health centers, as I said, Baylor and Texas Children's is pretty good, better than most, but most, don't even like their docs and scientists
yeah,
speaking out, right? They
yeah,
they want to control the message. It's all about, they're very risk averse. They're protecting the reputation of the institution. They only see the risk side. They don't, if you want to speak about social justice or combating anti-science, well, we guess we can't stop you, but they sort of cringe at the idea. And then, they say, well, ultimately you're a professor or a scientist here. You have academic freedom, dot,
yeah,
dot,
but
dot, but don't screw
yeah,
this up,
right.
and
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 so
and
that
don't
that
put the
is a
institution at risk, right?
You're describing exactly how
Yeah,
university communications
yeah,
works. But the
yeah.
point is,
And so you
and I,
do it with the sort of Damocles over your head. And as you know, and as anyone knows, if you do it enough, you will screw it up eventually, right? Everybody does. And you're going to make mistakes. That's how you learn. You make mistakes and you autocorrect. But you have to have that freedom to be able to make mistakes, and
yeah,
and right now
but
that's not there either.
what you're driving at, though, altogether, is that we're defenseless. That is, if you have an organized, finance, coordinated attack on science, and also, of course, on vaccines, and you have no defense, you have I mean, it's hard for the government to stand up because they're part of what's the conspiracy theory is against, and the scientific community, the clinician community, is kind of handcuffed, as you are getting at, and also that's not the culture that's unwilling, but something's got to give, and this is one thing I think you're really reinforcing that should be a pathway to countering. I mean, we can't clone you. We can't. We need lots of warriors. We
Yeah,
need,
yeah,
thousands and hundreds of thousands of points of light who support data and evidence, as best that they can, and we don't have that today.
yeah. And we need to cultivate that. So I'm in discussions, not only with people like yourself, but other colleagues about should we try to create, whether it's a nonprofit, a 501(c)(3) or C4. The climate scientists are ahead of the game on this.
Yeah,
I talk to
yeah.
Michael Mann every now and then, and you know they've got a climate science defense fund. They seem to be because they've they've experienced this for longer than we have. You know, this all started a decade before with attacks against climate scientists. You know, should in the book I talk about should we create something like a Southern Poverty Law Center equivalent to protect science and scientists, and I think we need that because the existing institutions don't seem willing to create something like that. It's somehow seen as too edgy or too out there,
Right.
and it shouldn't be. But again, this is I think a great opportunity for college presidents to step up, and they're not doing that. They're also pretty risk averse. So I think getting the heads of the academic health centers, getting the college president, university presidents to say, hey, this is important because otherwise science is at risk.
Yeah.
And you're already starting to see some crazy stuff come out of the NIH now about doing international research. They're trying to put in rules to say they want, if you have international collaborators, you're supposed to collect their notebooks and translate that. How are you going to do that? That's completely it's impossible. I mean, it's and who's going to review it and who's going to sign off in general legal counsel at the university on that's basically going to halt international research. And we have to recognize that we need this because the threats are coming, right? I mean,
And
climate change is real and pandemic threats are real. We're going to see another major coronavirus pandemic possibly before 2030, or a flu or an arbovirus, and we need this is a time we need to be reinforcing our virology research and our infectious disease research, not a time to start dismantling it, which is what
no,
the House hearings are meant to do and what some of these new NIH rulings are meant to do. So it's going to
yeah.
take a lot of strong players in government and at universities to stand up to this.
Well, if we ever need to be vaccinated or immunized, it's against this. And I hope that something will give to start to provide an antidote to what is a relentless progression of anti-science that you captured so elegantly, eloquently in your book, Peter. So thanks for writing that. Thanks for joining today. I know we'll have, as we do every week, conversations.
Yeah,
And
you've been an amazing friend and colleague, Eric, and I've learned so much from you.
no, no, I
I
feel
can't
just
tell you.
as thank you. I think it's completely reciprocal from what you bring to this table of trying to make this a better place for advancing science, search for the truth of what's really going on out there, rather than having to deal with wacky, extremists that are advancing things for various purposes that are nefarious in many cases. So appreciate it. We'll be talking some more, and this has been a really, for me, an enriching conversation.
Same, Eric, and thank you so much for giving this attention and the dialogue to be continued.